Do you have a DSLR that's lying in the cupboard unused while you keep taking pictures with your mobile camera, and every time you take a picture you say, "Ah, this is a crappy camera." But you don't want to take the DSLR out because it's got so many settings and features and it kind of like it's a bit scary and you don't know where to start? Well, you're in the right place. You start here. Today we'll talk about the basics of camera photography, the basics of DSLR, and how to start taking pictures using a DSLR without being worried that you're going to ruin the pictures. Let's go. So let's take things right from the basics. How do we see things? We see things when the light hits a subject, a person or an object, and then it hits our eyes. That's how we see things. The camera sees the things the same way. So the light hits the subject and then it hits the film, and that's how a picture is recorded. In today's times, in today's digital cameras, this is done by the light hitting the subject and the sensor in the digital camera. And how much light comes in, that can impact how the picture comes out. So we have three controls to control the amount of light coming into the camera and hitting the sensor. And these three things are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And when we have the balance of all these three things properly set up, then we get a picture which we call a correct exposure. The correct exposure means that the picture is not too bright, not too dark, it is perfectly in focus, and your subject is perfectly lit. There's no haziness, there's no blurriness to the subject. The background may be blurred, we'll talk about that later. So when we say shutter, what do we mean? The shutter is a physical block in front of the sensor so that the light doesn't keep hitting the sensor all the time. And this shutter opens for a limited amount of time when we click the photo. When we click it, that's also called shutter release, and it will open and close. Yes, it will open and close very quickly to allow some light to come in. Let's see what the effect of the shutter speed is on the camera, on the picture. Okay, so now see the shutter speed. You see this number 60? This is my shutter speed right now, and this is the dial that I use for changing it. If I move it to the left, see, that becomes 50, becomes 40, 30, right? And if I go to the right, it will be higher. Can you see how the scene is being affected? It's becoming darker the more I go to the right. See? You see that? So I can go all the way to 1/8,000 of a second, and it will become very, very dark. You're not afraid of the dark, are you? Oh, it's going to 10,000 even. So camera speed is measured in fractions of second. It can be in seconds as well, but that's very slow, and we call that slow exposure. I plan to do another tutorial on slow exposures themselves and how they are useful. But for now, for our purpose, for taking pictures of people or moving objects, let's consider shutter speeds in fractions of seconds. So it can be 1/50. So if you see 50 on the LCD screen of the camera, that means the shutter will speed for 50th of a second, or 1/100, 1/120, 1/160. So the faster the shutter speed, the faster your object can be that's moving on the screen, and you can still take a clear picture of those with a fast shutter speed. This also eliminates the shutter jerk or the camera jerk. When you're holding the camera and you press it, the camera shakes a very little bit. If the shutter speed is fast enough, that jerk doesn't matter. But if that speed is slow, then you have to hold the camera that much more steady. And that's why we use tripods for filming, because we want to use a slow shutter speed there. Okay, more on that when we get to the video tutorial. There's another setting that we need to talk about, and that is aperture. In very, very basic terms, aperture is just a hole through which the light enters. So this is your lens, then you can reduce the aperture or you can increase the aperture, which means that particular hole, the round hole, will open more or less. If it opens more, bigger hole, more light coming in. smaller hole, less light coming in. So other than having the picture become more bright or less bright with the aperture, there's another side effect that we will talk about in a little bit. So first let me explain how the aperture is measured. It is measured in fractions of the focal length. So if you have a 50 mm lens, then you might have f divided by 2.8. So f/2.8, or we call it f2.8, or simply 2.8. So the camera that I'm shooting with, the lens that I've got on it, is a f1.4 lens, which means that it can open the aperture up to f1.4 setting. So the lower the value, the bigger the hole, because it's dividing. So if we go to like f11, that means less light would be coming in, because bigger values means that much smaller hole to let the light come through. How we use that is when we need more light, we open the aperture more and we balance the shutter speed and the aperture together. And there are some considerations for both, which we will talk about. Okay, so now let's talk about aperture. This 2.8, that's the aperture. So if I go from this dial, this one, if I go to the left, it will be more open. So there will be a wider opening and more light will come in. See that? So this lens, this particular lens, can go up to 1.4, and you see it's burning everything out. You can't actually make out the details in the picture. But if you go more to the right, there we go. See that? So less light coming in. Less and less light coming in, and you can see more detail, and it's becoming darker now. So it can go up to, I think, 22. Nope, on this one it can only go to 16. That's the darkest we can go on this one. The third variable, the third factor that we can use to control the exposure is the ISO. And ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. So you can adjust that using the settings in the camera, and you can make it more reactive to the light or less. So the same amount of light is coming in physically, there's no change in that, but the sensor makes it brighter. So sensor reacts more to that, which can have an effect of making the picture more bright while the shutter speed and the aperture are constant. I'm gonna make the shutter speed fast. Okay, now it's dark. With ISO at 200, you can see this, and as we increase the ISO, it keeps going brighter and brighter. But if you see this scene, if you zoom in on it, you will see that it's got a lot of noise in it as well, which is the reason we try to keep the ISO as low as possible and compensate with the other settings before we start using the ISO. For example, the shutter speed or the aperture. Let's talk about these three items and their side effects with some practical examples. Let's see some pictures which are taken at different shutter speeds. So you see these pictures, and the shutter speed makes a difference as to how the cars look on the screen. They're all moving. So when you have the shutter speed at very low value, you can see the shutter speed on the picture. The 1/50 means 50th of a second, 1/120 means 1/20th of a second, and so on. So these are the two things. Shutter speed, main effect is letting the light in more or less depending on how fast the shutter is. The side effect is that you can use fast shutter speed to take pictures of things that are moving, cars, aeroplanes, children playing, or anything that's moving. It can also help you to reduce the jerk from the handheld camera. If you have the camera on a tripod, then you can use a lower shutter speed. Now let's look at some of the aperture practical examples. So as we discussed, the main effect of the aperture is to let more or less light in by widening that hole that is in the lens. And if we let more light in, as in the value of the aperture is low, as in 2.8 or 1.8, then you see that the subject is also in very sharp focus, but the background is blurred. And as you keep increasing that number, the hole becomes smaller and smaller, less light comes in, but also the background is coming in focus. So we use this wide aperture, which is why I have this 1.4 lens, the f1.4, because we can use this for portraits. So when you want to take pictures of a person in a way that they are in sharp focus, but the background is very much blurred, it's a very artistic effect. It's called bokeh or bokeh. There are two schools of thought. So it's Bokeh, and some people call it bokeh, some people call it bokeh. Suit yourself. So this bokeh effect is quite artistic and it's preferable. People like it. So that's why the lenses, they have sometimes they have 1.2 value, 1.4. So those and because these are called with f1.4, f1.2, they're also called f-stops. So when you see a button called f-stop, that is to control your aperture. So don't be confused by that. F-stop and aperture are the same setting. So now let's look at some photos with the ISO settings changing. With the higher settings of ISO, how the light increases, but also at very high values like 6000 or more, you can get noise. You know those dots that you can see in there. Let me zoom in on a picture and show you that noise. Do you see that? So that is noise, which means that your picture is not as sharp, and then you can see artifacts in the picture, which is why we try to use the ISO at a lower level, as in 100, 200, 400, as low as possible, so that the picture is sharp and there's no noise, there's no grain. The technical difference is that grain is what happens in film and noise is what happens in digital photos, where it's the exactly same thing when you see it visually. So when we're changing the settings in aperture, the side effect, that the bokeh effect that I'm talking about, it is also called depth of field. This is related to depth of field. When you have the aperture at very high values, as in like f11, f13, f15, then you have a huge depth of field. So pretty much everything is in focus. But as you keep reducing that in 3D, this field, this area keeps getting reduced, and this is the area where things are in focus. Let me give you an example. Last week I was shooting for my Osho by Sunny series, and I set up the camera on tripod because I'm setting up for myself. I set the focus, manual focus, with me sitting in the chair. But then when I actually did the text, when I talked in the video, then I sat back, and because I sat back, that distance was enough to put me out of focus. So it was a soft focus. I can show you an example here. You can see that. So I was out of focus because my aperture was 2.8, so it gives me only a little distance in which I am in focus. So you have to keep that in mind. So if you are taking pictures of things and you're using manual focus, then make sure that at high aperture values, f2.8, f at 1.8, and that kind of values, make sure that you dial in that focus very sharp, or use autofocus. For all these settings that I'm talking about, it's perfectly fine to use autofocus to take the pictures, and you can still keep learning. You can still start learning how these things affect the picture, and then that will help you build on your skills for taking great pictures. These three different types of settings that we have learned about, what are the practical uses of those? So let's take them one by one. Shutter speed. The use of low shutter speed is that if your area where you're taking pictures is too dark, you can lower the shutter speed and let more light come in. The side effect of that is that you have to keep it steady after a certain point. And the use of high shutter speed is that if you're taking pictures of moving objects, then you can use high shutter speed, and it will eliminate camera jerk as well. Aperture. For portrait type pictures, blurring the background, use the high values, very wide open aperture, f2.8, f1.8, f1.4, that sort of aperture, so that your background is blurred and you can take very nice portrait pictures. For taking landscape pictures where you want everything to be in focus, you want very deep depth of field, then you go to your higher values, f9, f11, f15, that sort of apertures. So at that time you might have to lower the shutter speed so that more light can come in. Okay, so you always have to balance these 2 or 3 values. ISO is very simple. We try to keep it low so that things are sharp, and we use it in low light, high ISO values as much as possible, and then you have to think about noise. So there's a trade-off. Other than these 3 items, there are other factors which can influence your exposure. For example, the camera flash or video lights on the set, or tripod, things like that. They are quite a vast area in themselves. So for right now, let's see, you want to take that DSLR out of the cupboard and then you start using it. So these 3 settings is what you would focus on. And practically, I would give you a bonus tip how to start using it. Keep your ISO at the lowest level, whatever your camera allows. It will be either 100 or 200. Your shutter speed, make it about 160, at least 160 of a second, so that if you're holding it in your hand, there's no camera jerk. Your pictures don't get blurred. And then from there, adjust the aperture to suit you, to suit the light. So ISO, lowest value, shutter speed at 1/60th of a second, and then aperture, you play with the aperture. And once you start playing with one setting, pretty soon you will start bringing them back, and then when you see the results, you will find out how each one is affecting, and practical experience will make you comfortable with your DSLR so much faster. So don't be too scared, go out, take some pictures. Okay, one bonus tip. When you start using these settings, when you start playing with them and you start taking pictures and experimenting with all the settings, by the time you come home, you would have taken at least maybe 100 photos, and I'm guessing more. If you go out for a few hours, you will take lots of pictures, and I encourage you to take as many as possible. But the point is, by the time you come home and you download those pictures to your computer, you would have forgotten what settings you used for each picture. And if you want to learn, you need to know those. And let me show you how to find that information in the file after you have downloaded it into the computer. Okay, so go into the folder where you have downloaded those pictures. This is my folder where we see these examples. So right click on the picture, the file, and then right click on properties, and then you see the tab that says details. Et voila! This has all the settings for that file, including the 3 settings that we were talking about. So f-stop is your aperture, the expose time is the shutter speed, and ISO speed is ISO. So now you can find those and you know what settings you used for that picture, and that way you can easily compare the effect of each setting on your photos. Okay, one bonus tip. These same settings, you can see them in the folder as well. It's very simple. Okay, so where you are, this is the folder where your pictures are. You have to be in this details view. Right click on the column headings. Yep, on top. And then see the columns thing? And then you can add these 3 settings into the columns that will be displayed for each file. Okay, and now if you click OK, you can see those settings right there. You can even sort by them, so you can have your slower shutter speed to higher shutter speed, or lowest aperture to highest aperture kind of things. So that way you can easily find out what settings each picture has and what effect they had on the photo. Happy shooting! Thank you for watching. We'll talk about slow exposure next time and what artistic value it adds to our photography. And please subscribe so that you can be notified of the next videos that I put up. Thank you.